SEP Fanfic Readings presents Osculum Annuum by My Delphi. Chapter 3. Fifth Year. Hermione wondered how her life might have been had she been sorted into a different house, or maybe just slightly less swotty and found female friends during her final year. If she had been a Ravenclaw, or Merlin help, a Slytherin, like the Sorting Hat had initially contemplated, would she live a life where her worst fear was getting an exceeds expectations on her OWLs, or having a breakout right before a date? Where she would spend her summers revising in peace, meeting up with female friends at a cafe, or browsing everything from her favorite bookstores to cute little boutiques filled with frilly dresses, talking in giddy voices about school crushes and the boys in her class. But her two best friends were Ron and Harry, and the only female friends were her dorm mates, and she wouldn't really say that she was close to them. Following her appearance at the Yule Ball with Victor and her sudden discovery of her femininity, Lavender and Parvati had started to treat her like she was more than merely a swotty bookworm who could help them if they didn't understand something. But then they had quickly realized that Hermione hadn't suddenly swapped her personality, and when she had been reluctant to share details about her relationship with Victor, their interest had disappeared again. It hadn't stopped Lavender from thrusting a sack of her old beauty magazines at Hermione at the end of their fourth year. At first, Hermione hadn't had much interest in them, but halfway through the summer she had finished her reading list, so she had picked up the forgotten stack of well-leafed-through magazines and glanced at the glossy pages. There were a lot of charms and spells about hiding pimples and minimizing pores, which Hermione had no use for. She had lost in the genetic hair lottery, but won when it came to good skin. There were many glamorous makeup spells that she wouldn't have any occasion to use until she was well into her 20s, hairstyles that were high fashion rather than anything a rational person would wear, and even glamours that would temporarily change one's eye color. Amidst the many spells that she would probably never use were a few hidden gems, spells that tamed even her hair in casual, uncomplicated everyday styles, charms that enhanced her already thick eyelashes or made her pink lips pop a bit more, and instructions on how to wave her wand to add a slight shine to her nails. But because her best friends weren't Lavender and Parvati, Hermione's summer reprieve was interrupted when an owl appeared at the kitchen window, a piece of parchment strapped to its leg. It screeched impatiently, batting its wings against the glass as if trying to convey the urgency of the message, and Hermione felt a sense of dread wash over her. When she opened it, she had been relieved that she had had the foresight to sit down beforehand, because she could feel her knees give out. Harry had used magic outside of school. He had broken the statute of secrecy and would be forced to appear before the Wizengamot, only to be interrogated like some criminal, as if he hadn't done it to protect his blasted cousin of all people. But that was Harry, risking far too much, even for those who least deserved it. And now he was facing expulsion from Hogwarts. Harry wasn't expelled. After fretting about his future and worrying herself sick, the hearing before the Wizengamot had been anticlimactic, according to Harry. Due to Dumbledore's intervention, Harry was cleared of all charges and free to return to their fifth year. But it had affected him more than he admitted, and Hermione was watching her best friend walk ahead of her with worried eyes. His shoulders tensed and his head lowered as insecurities gnawed at him. She exchanged a look with Ron, who shrugged, equally as helpless as she was. "I'll talk to him later," Ron promised quietly, putting a comforting hand on her shoulder. Relief flooded her, and she smiled gratefully at Ron. If anybody could help lessen the tension in Harry's shoulders and chase the frown on his face away, then it would be Ron, who somehow always knew what to say in dire situations. Hermione was well aware that her tendency to list possible positive outcomes and the likeliness of these outcomes wasn't a comfort to most. No, Harry needed to be smothered in Weasley warmth, and since Molly wasn't there, Ron or Ginny would have to make do. "Thank you, Ron." Her smile was tight. The worry knotting her stomach was just too much for anything more convincing. Harry had barely spoken a word since they had left King's Cross, either running his fingers over an old photograph of his parents or dozing off to the lulling rattling of the train, only to be startled awake sharply. Whatever he dreamt about, it couldn't be pleasant if it left him as pale and shaken as he was. "I'm surprised the Ministry is letting you walk around free, Potter," a voice sneered behind them, and when Hermione turned her head, she spotted the last person Harry needed right now. Draco Malfoy marched along the almost empty train, every step of his dragon-hide shoes sharp as he strutted towards them. He was flanked by his least intelligent cronies, Crabbe and Goyle, who looked as if they had little understanding of anything that happened around them. How they managed to pass their exams, Hermione didn't know. "Better enjoy it while you can," Malfoy jeered, walking past her, close enough for the newspaper in his hand to brush against her hip. "I expect there's a cell in Azkaban with your name on it." The last part was said directly into Harry's face, whose temper snapped. It was only Ron's quick thinking that prevented Harry from attacking Malfoy. The moment her friend lunged for the Slytherin, Ron had already wrapped his arm tightly around Harry's, holding him back with a strained grunt. Malfoy, meanwhile, jumped a step back, a hint of something that might be called surprise in his eyes. But he quickly recovered, sneering once again and straightening his already immaculate tie. "What did I tell you? Complete nutter," Malfoy told his friends, who chortled like the idiots they were. "Just stay away from me," Harry shouted, and the desperation in his voice broke Hermione's heart. "It's only Malfoy," Ron tried to soothe him. "What did you expect?" What did I expect? Hermione thought to herself as she watched Malfoy and the two other Slytherins head towards the carriages. Their eyes briefly met when he cast a glance back over his shoulder, but then he quickly looked away and hastened his already hurried steps. She didn't know what she had expected. For Malfoy to suddenly mature over the summer and stop being such a prat? For him to discover that maybe he had a single ounce of empathy inside of him? For him to be replaced by a Draco Malfoy who didn't act like it was his life's mission to make Harry, and all those who were associated with him, miserable? Maybe. Because as much as she had tried to avoid thinking about Malfoy over the summer, he had somehow still managed to slip into her mind every other day. Hermione still didn't understand what had possessed him to kiss her after the second task, and Hermione hated not understanding something. It was almost like an itch in the back of her mind that she couldn't scratch. The Ministry had started investigating Hogwarts and tried to unsubtly keep an eye on Dumbledore, and their pink watchdog was a menace. Dolores Umbridge had irked Hermione the moment she had disturbed the welcoming feast with her high-pitched giggle, and it had only gotten worse when she had insisted that Defense Against the Dark Arts was merely a theoretical class, and that they wouldn't need to ever actually use defensive spells, because there was nothing to defend against. Harry's insistence that he had watched Voldemort regain a physical body and his power had fallen on deaf ears, much to Hermione's dismay. And then the other students who had been Harry's friends, were beginning to doubt him as well. It was outrageous. Not as outrageous as using a blood quill on a student, though. The angry lines on the back of Harry's hand had made her stomach turn, and angry tears burned in her eyes. It was so unfair. And then Umbridge started wielding the power she had to make their school lives miserable. Her ridiculous and antiquated rules seemed to suck out every ounce of joy Hogwarts held, slowly turning the once cheerful school into a dreary place. Teachers were interrogated during classes, and Hermione had to swallow down her anger whenever Umbridge made a snide comment or wrote down something in her notebook with a condescending smile. And although there was no love lost between her and Sybil Trelawney, nor the subject of divination, she felt righteous fury at seeing Umbridge attempting to kick out the witch. Yes, Hermione was convinced that divination was nothing but ridiculous blathering that occasionally hit the mark. But when one spewed countless prophecies, some were bound to be right. And yes, it was the only subject she had ever dropped. However, she loathed Umbridge much more than she loathed the idea of trying to read the future in her cup of breakfast tea. Luckily, Dumbledore interfered, although he rarely did these days. It felt as if their headmaster had shut himself into his office, distancing himself from everyone, and especially Harry, who needed his support now more than ever. Because something wasn't right. She had watched the dark circles underneath his eyes grow, and how he had become paler and paler, until even Malfoy's complexion looked positively healthy in comparison. And when Ron had quietly told her about Harry's nightmares, she had felt her stomach sink as if it had turned into lead. And for the first time in her life, Hermione felt helpless, because although she had scoured the entire Hogwarts library, there had been no books to help her understand what was wrong with her friend. Research was her thing, and she was convinced that everything could be explained if one only found the right book. But there was nothing. And although Harry smiled at her tiredly and thanked her for her efforts, she felt as if she had failed him. The school year derailed, and Hermione continued to wonder how her life would have been had things been different. What would she do now, had her parents moved to France like they had contemplated when she had been less than a year old? If she would have gone to Beauxbatons instead, Would she now sit listening to nymphs serenade her while watching fairies flutter about? Instead, she was forced to watch the restricted section of the library grow as Umbridge decided that more and more books were unsuitable for students. Hermione held the firm belief that no book should have been restricted or withheld, and also had disapproved of the idea of a restricted section, but she kept her mouth shut. Banning books was a slippery slope that forebode dangerous indoctrination. In addition, there was a pointy-faced, far too tall, human-shaped problem in Hermione's life. Draco Malfoy had turned into a piece of work. If Hermione had even thought for a moment that the expression on his face when he had kissed her after the second task had been worry for her, she had been so wrong, because it was clear that Malfoy thought very little of her. His scathing comments had come back with a vengeance, and he used every opportunity to make a snide remark in her direction. When he wasn't spitting insults, he was busy ignoring her in favor of Pansy Parkinson. Their relationship had rekindled, and they seemed to celebrate it by being as public as possible without angering Umbridge. Umbridge, whom Malfoy had quickly aligned himself with, like the bootlicking opportunist he was. Kissing him at the Yule Ball had been a mistake. Letting him kiss her that day in the forest had been an even bigger one. Because there was nothing likable about Draco Malfoy, and whatever good she had tried to see in him had turned out to be her mind projecting something that wasn't there. He was rotten to the core. Hermione knew that she wasn't the goody two-shoes everyone thought she was. She had set fire to a professor's cloak in her first year. In second, she had brewed a highly restricted potion by nicking supplies from the teacher she had set fire on the previous year. Abused a time-turner in her third, kept Rita Skeeter in a jar, and blackmailed her into giving Harry a proper interview in her fourth. But founding a secret organization that broke every school rule by merely existing? That was out there, even for her. In comparison to that, the jinxed contracts she forced the DA members to sign were positively harmless, even if they led to possibly lifelong disfigurement. And yet, people were under the impression that she was a rule-obeying bookworm, who knew a lot about magical theory but wasn't especially threatening in actual combat. When Ron had told her he would go easy on her in the Room of Requirement, making most of DA's army chuckle in agreement with him, Hermione had bitten the inside of her cheek to keep her temper in check. It hadn't stopped the blotches of anger looming high on her cheeks, and she had seen Harry wince out of the corner of her eye, even before Ron had pointed his wand at her. He had barely been able to take a breath when she had already said, "Stupefy!" and slashed her wand, watching in satisfaction as he was flung off his feet, flew through the air, and landed on his back with a grunt. And although he had played it off in front of the other students, she had noticed the admiration in his gaze and basked in it. Access to the Room of Requirement also allowed her to practice outside of the DA meetings. Whenever she had the chance, she would sneak away and try her hand at voiceless casting. It was difficult, and as someone who wasn't used to struggling with things, Hermione quickly grew frustrated. It took her 2 weeks before she was able to cast Leviosa without saying the spell out loud, and another 2 before she could disarm an enemy wordlessly. To her surprise, wandless casting came much easier to her, and the first time she had been able to cast a Lumos by merely willing it, she had been filled with pure joy. And although the ball of light had only hovered above the palm of her hand for a few seconds before it flickered and disappeared, it furled her determination. But no matter how subtle and sneaky they tried to be, it didn't take long for Umbridge to realize that something was going on. Filch and that damned cat of his became more of a nuisance than they had been before, attempting to tail them. Luckily with very little success. Umbridge's reaction, founding the Inquisitorial Squad. Hermione wasn't surprised when she saw the badge on the lapel of Malfoy's cloak, and yet she felt a strange sense of disappointment flood her. It was also no surprise that his Goonies were quick to follow their leader and sign up as well. Although knowing that he kept himself surrounded by idiots, Hermione was all too aware that only one who might be able to catch them would be Malfoy. Still, she hadn't expected him to catch her, thinking herself sneaky enough to avoid him. One moment she was walking down the dimly lit corridor, long after curfew, and holding her breath as she tried to listen for Mrs. Norris's meowing. The next she heard quiet steps behind her. It was a split-second decision. Hermione broke into a sprint, holding on to the hood of her cloak that kept her hair and face hidden, so none of the DA members would be identified should they be spotted from afar by the Inquisitorial Squad. She sent the stupefy over her shoulder, not taking the time to properly aim the spell, leading to her missing her target. Cursing slightly, she continued running, taking 2 stairs at once in hopes of shaking off whoever was pursuing her. While she didn't have much physical strength, she was still sporty and could easily outrun both Crabbe and Goyle, who were all too fond of pudding and never said no to something sweet. She would also be able to outrun Parkinson, who was as interested in physical exercise as Hermione was in Quidditch. There was no way Filch would catch up with her with his hobbling gait. But then a hand closed around her arm, and she was pushed against the wall, her back hitting the stone hard enough for her to cry out in surprise. The hood was ripped from her head at the same time as something hard dug into the side of her neck. A wand. She ceased struggling immediately, blinking up at her pursuer while breathing heavily. Her sides were stinging and her lungs burned, as did her legs from trying to conquer so many steps. But she barely noticed it when she realized that Malfoy had caught her, his blazing eyes boring into hers. She knew that he was good enough in Dada that he would be able to immobilize her, should she even attempt some wandless jinx or hex. Not to mention that he held the highest score in the Slytherin Dueling Club, which had not been shut down by Umbridge, undoubtedly because it was exclusive to pureblood heirs, and would thus affect families that the Ministry wanted on their side. And Hermione also knew that he would undoubtedly drag her with him and present her to Umbridge. She could already feel the blood quill etching letters into the back of her hand. But Malfoy didn't speak, and neither did he move. Instead, he was just staring at her, his gaze flickering over her face and hair before meeting hers again. There was a fight in the strange shade of silver-blue eyes, a silent battle. For a moment, the tip of his wand dug deeper into the skin of her throat, and she winced. Then Malfoy released a harsh breath and flicked his wand away. Umbridge has used a disillusionment charm, and is hiding in the eastern corridor. The words were rushed out, spoken so fast that she almost didn't understand him. Malfoy? Hermione began, her heart beating faster again, but he shook his head. Go, now, he ordered, and took 2 steps back. In the distance, she could hear thundering steps, as well as a voice calling Malfoy's name that sounded like Crabbe. I said go! Hermione spurred into action. She rose to the tips of her toes, and quickly brushed her lips against his cheek, low enough to catch the corner of his mouth. Thank you, she whispered against his skin before she turned on her heels and rushed away. When she looked back, she found Malfoy staring after her with an inscrutable expression on his pointy face, and his wand slack in his hands. Later, she would blame the not-quite-a-kiss on the adrenaline rush. Hermione decidedly did not think about what she had dubbed the incident with Malfoy. It would undoubtedly lead her to growing frustrated, because she couldn't figure out his motivations for the life of her. He should have ratted her out. That was how he worked, being the cockroach he was. He didn't like her. She was convinced he despised her simply based on the fact that she was a Muggle-born, because why else would he spit the word mudblood at her? Maybe that punch in 3rd year had knocked his head hard enough against the stone for his personality to split in 2. 2 very different versions of Malfoy. The nasty one was easy enough to understand, and came from a place of ignorant and arrogant upbringing. The other one was confusing and didn't make sense. Thinking about it for too long gave her headaches, so she ignored him, which was easy enough because he ignored her too. Instead, she watched Harry fall in love with Cho Chang, delighting in the fact that he had got to experience being a somewhat normal teenager for once. When the two went to Hogsmeade together during the last Hogsmeade weekend before Christmas break, Ron had to physically tug her past the Madame Puttyfoots, because she tried to get a glimpse through the window to see how Harry's date was going. It was only when Ron promised he would go with her to Tomes and Scrolls, without complaining, that she was sufficiently distracted. And to Ron's credit, he did patiently wait until she had picked out a selection of new books, and dutifully carried them for her. They speculated about whether or not Harry and Cho's date went well over a butterbeer and the 3 broomsticks, the 2 of them sitting next to each other on one of the benches, Ron close enough that his shoulder was brushing against her own. Just a year ago, it would have made Hermione's heart skip a beat, but now she could only view him for what he was, her best friend, whom she was incredibly fond of, but felt only platonic love for. And she only had the ferret to blame, who somehow had made it impossible for her to fall in love with anybody. Not that there was a line of boys wanting to ask her on a date. Despite her now tamed hair and the subtle makeup spells, the fact that she kept her nose buried in her books and relied on Ron and Harry to guide her past obstacles when she was reading while walking through the hallway seemed to chase most male students away. But her cheerful mood quickly disappeared, because only days later Harry had a vivid dream about Arthur Weasley being attacked by Voldemort's pet snake, which turned out to be more than just a dream. Ron had almost fainted when he discovered that his father had barely survived. Ginny walked around with red eyes for the remainder of the week, and even Fred and George were unusually subdued. Hermione herself felt sick to her stomach, and she couldn't sleep, too worried about the man who had begun to treat her like a second daughter. And as if that wasn't enough to rob her of all her sleep, Harry seemingly had Voldemort in his head through some kind of link. It allowed the megalomaniac, psychopathic dark wizard access to her best friend's mind. And all the occlumency lessons in the world couldn't help him, because as much as she adored Harry, she was aware of just how oblivious he was to the things happening around him. And something like occlumency required an iron will and a high degree of self-control. When she agreed to spend Christmas at Grimmauld Place, she was in no mood for any sort of festivities. Still, seeing Arthur alive and breathing, a smile on his banged-up face, made it easier for her to breathe for the first time in a long time. Molly tried to chase the hint of soberness in the air away by being her usual cheerful self, handing out second helpings of Christmas dinner like they were in danger of starving to death at any moment. The warmth radiating from the Weasley matriarch was touching, and Hermione had to brush away a tear when she received her very own handmade Molly Weasley sweater, a large H at the front, and so soft that it felt as if she had been wrapped in a cloud. But her joy was slightly dampened by Molly's unsubtle attempts of getting her and Ron alone. Over the course of the holidays, people would find sudden excuses to grant her and her best friend some privacy, and there were multiple mentions of how they were at the age where love blossomed, especially after everybody found out about Harry and Cho. It came to a head when she found herself entrapped underneath the magical mistletoe with Ron, who couldn't look at her without blushing, muttering something about having a word with Fred and George. Hermione smiled, pecked his cheek, and sent a quick spell towards the mistletoe, making it vanish into the air with a small pop. Once again, she thought, that a year ago she would have been delighted by the opportunity. But now she was merely exasperated because Ron was her best friend, and she didn't want to jeopardize that friendship. He was far too important to her for that. And although it made Christmas exhausting, Hermione would still agree to spend the holidays at Grimmauld, because it allowed her to see Harry with Sirius. And the happiness on her friend's face whenever he spoke to his godfather was enough to make her ridiculously sentimental. But with the end of the holidays came the unrelenting shadow of Dolores Umbridge, who had taken to target Hagrid. It was followed by an incident at Azkaban, where countless Death Eaters were freed. The fact that the Ministry blamed Sirius, remaining willfully ignorant to the obvious threat, made her boil with rage. At least the student body didn't share the minister's opinion, because many of them voiced quiet apologies to Harry for doubting him. But always, there were strange moments of beauty between all the dark and dreary. The first time Hermione had been able to cast a corporeal Patronus in the room of requirement while under the careful guidance of Harry, she had felt undulated happiness spread through her body. A giddy laugh had escaped her as the silver otter happily swam around her form before diving through the room, joining Ron's barking terrier and Luna's adorable bunny. The room of requirement had been breached. Umbridge had gotten her hands on the list of the members of the DA. Marietta Edgecombe had the word sneak written across her face with ugly, seeping boils. Malfoy was standing behind Finch, avoiding her eyes and his face expressionless, while his cronies and the rest of the inquisitorial squad were grinning meanly. Dumbledore took the blame, disappearing before he could be dismissed, and Umbridge took over his post, accepting the title of headmistress with an air of ceremony as if Fudge had crowned her the Queen of England. Her first act was to round up the members of the DA and present them with her favorite disciplinary measure, that dreaded blood quill. As Hermione wrote line after line, she bit her tongue to refrain from showing any and all emotions, all too aware that Umbridge's small, mouse-like eyes were watching her. She would not break and give that old cow the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Stoically, she held out, finished her assignment, and ignored Padma's quiet sobs or Ron's pained groans. Hermione was the first to finish and hand in her written lines. She looked straight at Umbridge as she gave her the parchment, keeping up an air of defiance that made the headmistress's thin mouth tighten, before she marched out of the great hall and back to Gryffindor Tower. She was in no mood to be pestered by anybody about the counterjinks for Edgecombe's boils, nor did she want to listen to another's crying or complaining about the blood quill. She wanted to curl up in her bed and pretend that nothing outside of her duvet existed, and that Hogwarts was still her home away from home, and not this terrible institution, where children lived under the constant fear of archaic punishment. But when she approached the portrait of the fat lady, she realized that she wouldn't even be granted that. A tall figure was lingering in front of the portrait, leaning against the wall. As soon as he heard her approach, his head snapped up and a scowl spread across his pointy face. "Fuck off, Malfoy," Hermione sighed, not finding it in herself to keep up even the slightest of pleasantries. He was the last person she wanted to see at that moment, and a tiny part of her worried that she might punch him again if he made another scathing remark. "Shut up, Granger," Malfoy said harshly, and bridged the distance between them with 2 fast strides. His eyes were burning with something she couldn't name, not that she wanted to. All she wanted when it came to Malfoy was to forget that he even existed. "Show me," Malfoy demanded, and Hermione instinctively hid her hand behind her back. "There's nothing to see," she mumbled, keeping her voice low so it wouldn't break. No tears, not now. She had sworn to herself to keep them at bay until she had crawled into her bed. She would not let Malfoy see her cry. She would not— Granger. Suddenly, warm fingers touched her chin, nudging it upward so she was forced to look at him. His touch was oddly gentle, and although his expression on his face was hard, it wasn't unkind. "Show me." Hermione clenched her jaw stubbornly, but Malfoy merely raised one pale eyebrow and waited. Shoulders slumping, she gave in. She didn't have it in her to fight. When she held out her hand, Malfoy's fingers carefully clasped around her wrist, turning it slightly so he could inspect the red, angry letters. While he looked down at their hands, Hermione kept her eyes locked onto his face, and the anger she saw surprised her. Even more did the flicker of guilt. "Does it hurt?" he asked quietly. Hermione bit her bottom lip when it started trembling. It wasn't the pain that made her want to break into tears. No. The pain caused rage to build up inside her. Rage and fury and the burning need for revenge. It was the fact that she no longer felt safe at Hogwarts, no longer felt comfortable being at school, no longer looked forward to class. And it was the fact that Dumbledore had barely put up any resistance, despite the numerous titles he held in the wizarding world, instead leaving them at the hands of a sadistic woman with a burning need for control. Taking a deep breath, Hermione tugged her hand out of his grasp. "Do you care?" she whispered back, and saw his expression shudder before it quickly closed off. Almost like someone had pulled a curtain shut, and all she was able to see was a blank wall. Malfoy didn't answer. He simply continued to stare at her, and Hermione shook her head. "Just go and gloat with your cronies about having finally caught us, Malfoy," she sighed, suddenly tired. Of him, of Umbridge, of the entire situation, and especially of his confusing behavior. Not giving him a chance to reply, Hermione buried her aching hand in the pocket of her robes and disappeared through the portrait hole into the Gryffindor common room. She was done trying to decipher him and his motivations. The letters were still burning the next day. They reopened when she washed her hands slightly too thoroughly, staining the water pink. A few students had applied bandages, and Hermione smiled gratefully at Parvati when she offered to wrap her hand as well. The entire DA was muted and subdued, and even hearing Harry call her little jinx on the parchment brilliant didn't improve Hermione's mood. She picked apart her plain toast, keeping her eyes fixed on her plate after having glanced at the high table once, only to find Umbridge sitting in Dumbledore's seat, drinking tea out of a ridiculously flowering cup while grinning like a Cheshire cat. She also refused to look at the Slytherin table, uninterested in seeing the inquisitorial squad gloat and smirk at them. But it was hard to ignore the set of eyes that were staring at the back of her head, making her skin break out into goosebumps. She knew who was watching her, and she wished he would just leave her in peace. "I think I'll go to the library. I need to finish an essay," she muttered, discarding the slice of toast that she had picked apart. Harry and Ron nodded mutely, both equally unenthusiastic about their breakfast. Harry especially looked worse for wear. The nightmares were increasing in frequency again. Gathering her satchel, she left the great hall, all too aware that he was still watching her. When she heard sharp, hurried steps catching up with her shortly before she reached the library, Hermione wasn't surprised. "What do you want?" she asked tiredly, just as his fingers closed around her arm to stop her. Just like he had done when he had caught her so many months ago, only to let her go. Her cheeks burned at the memory of her kissing his cheek in a moment of adrenaline-fueled madness. Malfoy glowered down at her with thin lips. His gaze flickered to her bandaged hand before snapping back to meet hers. He didn't seem intent on saying anything. Fine. I don't have time for this, Malfoy, Hermione bit out, tugging on her arm to break free of his grasp, but he wasn't letting go. Instead, his free hand reached into the pocket of his robes and procured a small jar. He thrust it at her, and Hermione barely managed not to drop it. It fit into the palm of her hand and was cool to the touch. It was unlabeled and looked nondescript and plain for someone like Malfoy. Apply generously twice a day until everything is healed, and don't share it with anybody else, the Slytherin ordered, his voice a mere hiss. He didn't give her any time to say anything in return. Never mind thank him. Turning on his heels and storming off with an almost amusingly dramatic flare of his robes. She absent-mindedly wondered if Snape gave the Slytherins private lessons on how to make one's coat flare dramatically when entering or exiting a room. Hermione looked at the small pot again and quickly ducked into the girls' bathroom when she heard voices coming closer. Making sure that there was nobody else inside, she finally unscrewed the lid and inspected the contents closely. It was a salve of sorts, smelling distinctly of pomegranates. When she dipped her fingers into it, she was surprised by how thick it was. She hesitated, because for all she knew, Malfoy might have given her something that would stain her skin purple, or cause an untreatable rash. But there was a tiny voice in the back of her mind suddenly piqued that she could trust him. No, I can't. He's Malfoy. He's the last person I will ever trust, she quickly thought, squashing that tiny voice, trying to convince her otherwise, ruthlessly. And yet, she removed her bandages before applying the salve to the back of her hand, spreading it generously over the jagged letters. She inhaled sharply when the lingering pain turned into a pleasant tingling sensation. Right in front of her eyes, the bloody lines paled until they looked as if they were no longer fresh, but days old. Cho Chang broke up with Harry. While he thought Hermione's safety precaution had been brilliant, Cho thought very differently. It led to them splitting up, and although Harry insisted that their relationship would have had no future anyways, she still felt guilty for taking this from him. But truthfully, Ron looked more heartbroken by the end of their best friend's relationship than Harry, which was probably due to the fact that Ron had started wanting to have a relationship too. But as always, he was overlooked in the shadow of the boy who lived, and few girls glanced twice at him. Something Hermione could somewhat relate to, because it wasn't like anybody had bothered to look at her twice. The only one interested in her was Hagrid's brother. And while it was adorable to be handed half a bicycle and see the joy in Grop's face when she rang the bell, a giant unable to speak and chained to a tree wasn't exactly the admirer most witches, Hermione included, wished for. However, what affected Harry far more than Cho's decision ever could was a glimpse of Snape's memories. How he had managed to invade their potion professor's mind when Snape was such a highly skilled occlumens, Hermione didn't know, but it had harsh consequences. For one, because Snape ended their lessons and left Harry to fend for himself. But more importantly, because Harry realized that his vision of his father as this great wizard had been false, and that James Potter had more in common with someone like Draco Malfoy than any of them were comfortable with. It turned him into the same sullen young man he had been at the beginning of the school year, and made it seemingly impossible for him to focus on the study schedule Hermione had put together for him. It led to her worrying about him not getting good enough marks in his potions OWLs to be unable to take the advanced potion-making course, which would lead him to not being able to start as an Auror once he had graduated. But all thoughts of potions marks in advanced courses promptly left Hermione's mind when Harry dreamed about Sirius being attacked. It made the color drain from her face and her blood run cold because Harry could not lose another person. Not again. Not when Sirius had become such an important figure in his life, and the only remaining link to his parents. He needed someone in his life to tell him about how much his parents loved him and how important he was to them. Someone who had witnessed it. No matter what, he couldn't lose Sirius. Which is why Hermione agreed to the insane plan of trying to contact Sirius from Umbridge's office, throwing all caution in the wind and subsequently being caught. She ignored the fact that Malfoy was standing right next to her, while he and his cronies kept them in place so Umbridge could interrogate Harry. Her mind was feverishly trying to come up with a solution to get them out of this predicament, because Harry couldn't lose Sirius. Which was why she found herself leading Umbridge into the Forbidden Forest, doing the one thing she hated to do: improvise. For some reason, it worked in their favor for once, and Hermione briefly wondered if keeping Skeeter trapped in a jar had been worse or not, as she watched the centaurs dragging Umbridge deeper into the Forbidden Forest. Her high-pitched, terrified screeches echoed through the trees and were suddenly cut off. It didn't matter, because Harry couldn't lose Sirius. Which was why she now swung herself onto the back of a creature she couldn't see and held on to it for dear life as they flew to London. If she had to choose between Thestrals and brooms, she would pick the broom next time. At that point, Hermione did not yet know that she would ride far worse things than Thestrals, just as she did not yet know that it wouldn't be the only time she broke into the Ministry. All of it didn't matter, though, because Harry could not lose Sirius. Only, Sirius was nowhere to be found. Hermione realized it was a trap a split second before the figure appeared from the shadows, clad in Death Eater robes with a dark mask obscuring their face. The silky voice behind it was strangely familiar, and when they finally revealed their face, Hermione's heart stopped. She hadn't seen Lucius Malfoy in quite a while, and the similarities between father and son unsettled her. But as she listened to the older Malfoy speak softly to Harry, his voice luring and lulling and dripping with false empathy, she could only think of how Lucius Malfoy had the same mouth as his son. She had to stifle a hysterical giggle at the thought of what he might say, should he find out that his precious pure-blood heir had kissed a mudblood repeatedly. He would undoubtedly drop this ridiculous facade and spew the same slurs as his sister-in-law, who had a manic glint in her eyes and was twitching with anticipation as more and more Death Eaters surrounded them. And then Harry suddenly ran, and so did she, through endless rows of prophecies, past whispering shadows and cloaked figures, dodging spells left, right, and center, trying to make use of every bit of magic she knew and hoping that her friends wouldn't get hurt. Her blood ran cold with undiluted fear when she realized that one Death Eater was specifically targeting her. She recognized him from the Daily Prophet and subsequently wanted posters. Anton Dolohov, who had been part of the group of wizards who had killed Molly's brothers in an act of unspeakable brutality, and who was eyeing her with something that made every female alarm bell ring. A primal terror overcame her when his impediment jinx hit her, Neville, and Harry, because she was all too aware of what had happened to witches who ended up in the clasps of Death Eaters, something wizards were almost always spared from. Terrified and unable to move, she watched him reveal his mark to alert the other Death Eaters of their location, his glinting eyes never leaving her body. Panic gripped her body and her magic responded, flaring to life with previously unknown brightness. She could feel the power in every cell of her body, and it was almost too easy to cast the silencing charm and break the jinx holding them in place. Astonishment was written across Neville's face, confusion across Harry's, and Dolohov was fuming with rage. He raised his wand, a flash of purple lightning striking her before she could throw up a shield. It almost resembled a flame as it touched her chest, licking across her skin. For a moment, she felt nothing, and then a piercing pain overcame her. It was so sudden and intense that she didn't even scream. All that escaped her was a small, "oh," before her legs gave out, and she crumpled to the floor. She had always thought death would be kinder, washing away all pain and fear and agony, to replace it with nothingness. Hermione survived, albeit barely. Had he not been silenced, his spell would have been undoubtedly lethal. When she awoke, it was to Ron sitting in the uncomfortable hospital chair next to her bed, and Harry standing at the window overlooking the Black Lake, a haunted, resigned expression on his pale face. A copy of the Daily Prophet was laying on the table to her left, the headline declaring Voldemort's return, and that Fudge had stepped down from his post as Minister of Magic. Underneath, it mentioned that most of the Death Eaters attacking them had been arrested at the DOM. It also contained a picture of Umbridge, declaring that she would be investigated, and that Dumbledore had been reinstated as headmaster of Hogwarts. But her relief only lasted until Ron stirred in his chair and realized that she had woken up. Sirius had died. It had all been for naught. And to top it all off, She wasn't allowed to return to her dorms, having to spend the last 2 weeks at school at the infirmary, swallowing horridly tasting potions under Madame Pomfrey's watchful eye. Her friends kept her company, and Ron went as far as sneaking to Honeyduke's to get her a box of peppermint toads in an attempt to make her smile. Hermione was discharged on the last day of term, having just enough time to pack her bags and store away the small chest full of potions that she was to take over the summer, with strict instructions not to overexert herself. Madame Pomfrey recommended that she spend her summers sitting in the shade and reading, something Hermione didn't argue with. And although Ron, Harry, Ginny, and Luna had been present when Madame Pomfrey had said that Hermione was out of danger, her friends still turned into overprotective mother hens and refused to let her carry her purse as they were on their way to the train station, the castle disappearing behind them. They fluttered about her, fluffing her pillow in the compartment they claimed as theirs to make her more comfortable, and she hadn't been able to take it anymore. As soon as the train had left the station, she had mumbled something about having to use the loo and shaken off Ginny's offer to go with her, only to slip into an empty compartment and bury her face in her hands. Hermione took a few deep breaths, trying to calm herself. She knew that they came from a place of worry, and she knew that Harry was the main instigator behind their behavior. He had lost Sirius, and come close to almost losing her as well. He blamed himself for the death of his godfather, and Hermione's run-in with Dolohof's curse, although it wasn't his fault. And he was channeling all of his energy into her so he wouldn't have to confront his grief. Hermione knew, but that didn't make her feel any less smothered. The door to the compartment opened with a loud bang, and Hermione flinched, ready to assure Harry or Ron that she was fine and that they didn't have to worry. But it was Malfoy who stepped into the small compartment and closed the door behind him just as harshly as he had opened it. She watched apprehensively as he tugged down the blinds and cast a spell that stopped others from entering. Then he turned around and stepped towards her. Wordlessly, Hermione held his gaze, her heart clenching at the shadows in his eyes. Something ominous surrounded him, an air of knowledge, of fear, of resignation. He knew just as well as she did that their world was on the brink of war, and that they would be standing on opposite sides, that their time as children, as teenagers, was coming to an end. Darkness was brewing, and it would come after them all too soon, trying to taint and change and devour them. They wouldn't be the same people next year, nor any year after that. They would be fundamentally changed until they forgot who they had been in the first place. Deep down, Hermione knew that this would be the last time she saw the version of Draco Malfoy that had stolen her first kiss. And for some reason, that hurt almost as much as Dolohof's curse. They didn't speak. Malfoy sat down on the padded bench across from her, holding his hand out. She took it, allowing him to tug her towards him, closer and closer, until she was sliding into his lap. His hand settled on her waist, while hers came to rest on his shoulders, gliding over the fabric of his black suit. His thumb was drawing small, invisible circles against the sharp bones of her hips. Malfoy tilted his head ever so slightly, and Hermione didn't hesitate. Their mouths slotted together perfectly, with a sense of familiarity that unsettled her. His lips were soft but urgent, yet not desperate like they had been in the forest. He kissed her deeply, unhurriedly, as if trying to slow down time and drag the moment out. Her fingers wound around his hair again, his thumb continuously drawing circles. He swallowed her wine when their tongues met, and she inhaled his strong gasp when she shifted her hips slightly and bumped something firm that made her cheeks flame. Malfoy stole one kiss after another, and Hermione willingly let him. Her heart was pounding in her chest, fluttering almost painfully against her ribs, as she briefly wondered whether or not this went against Madame Pomfrey's orders, or if making out with someone who was most definitely not one's boyfriend, and qualified more as some kind of enemy, when one had barely survived a lethal curse and was still suffering from after-effects. But that thought quickly disappeared, because Malfoy was truly an unfairly talented kisser. "Did you find her?" Ron's voice outside of the compartment made Malfoy freeze underneath her, and Hermione felt as if she had turned into stone herself. "No, maybe she went looking for the trolley." That was Ginny. "Or came across Neville and Luna?" "Maybe. I'll go get Harry. She's got to be somewhere on this train," muttered Ron, and 2 sets of steps were hurrying away. Merlin's beard. How long had she been gone? And how long had her friends been looking for her? She needed to get back before they could blow this out of proportion. Malfoy seemed to follow her line of thought, because he removed his hands from her hips and merely watched silently as she climbed back to her feet and straightened her skirt. When she reached for the door, he stood up as well. Granger. Hermione turned her head, glancing up at him over her shoulder. And once again, she couldn't read the expression in his eyes. This was the Malfoy she didn't understand, the riddle that irked her. An enigma that she would never solve, because the world was running out of time and war was on the horizon. She waited for Malfoy to speak, and for a moment his lips moved as if he was trying to taste the lips before they left his mouth. But then he quickly clamped them shut. His brows furrowed, a deep frown marring his face, and something pained flashed through his eyes. He didn't say anything. Instead, he merely raised a hand and ran a finger gently over her cheek. It was perhaps the most baffling thing he had done yet, and Hermione could only stare at him open-mouthed. Then he cast a disillusionment charm on himself, before pushing her out of the compartment and raising the blinds again. She stumbled over her own feet, thrown slightly off balance by Malfoy's contrary nature, only to be caught by familiar arms. "Hermione?" Ron asked above her, his eyes wide and worried. "Where were you? We looked everywhere for you." "Oh," she breathed and quickly cleared her throat to chase away the hoarseness in her voice. "I was just feeling a bit dizzy and had to sit down for a moment." She motioned towards the seemingly empty compartment and hoped that Malfoy's disillusionment charm would hold. Ron's brows furrowed slightly as he glanced over her shoulder, but there was no suspicion in his eyes, only worry and relief. "You shouldn't go off by yourself until you're fully recovered," he then decided, putting an arm around her waist as if worried she might faint at any moment. "I'm all better now," Hermione muttered, still feeling the lingering warmth of Malfoy's hands on her hips as she allowed her best friend to tug her away. There was one question on her mind. What had Malfoy wanted to say? What had he held back? And would it maybe have changed the course of what awaited them in the future?